Well, everybody that's listening, if you're listening to us on the radio, we greatly appreciate that. If you're listening to us on one of the podcasting sites, like, subscribe, share, all that razzle dazzle stuff. Definitely get this out to as many people as possible. We have a very special guest coming to us, I believe, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, from Kentucky, which tomorrow is going to be in the heat of things with the big governor's race and many other elections all around the country and around the state of Kentucky. This is Chris Skates. He is the author of Moonshine Over Georgia and also is a former speechwriter, policy administrator for many administrators and politicians, a chemist for 30 years. He's written 4 novels and over 300 articles and short stories. Chris, that's a hell of a resume. It's even getting tougher for me to keep going down the line there, but I appreciate you coming on.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's talk about the book before we get into politics in general. So the new book out, Moonshine Over Georgia. Can we just start with giving the audience a little bit of a synopsis about what it's about?
I don't know if I'm not showing that very well, am I? Yeah, it's really a morality tale based on actual events. My grandfather was a revenue agent in the 30s and 40s. So those guys their sole focus was moonshine. And moonshine was a multi-million-dollar business at a time when $1 million was a hell of a lot of money. It was $1 million business in the United States in the 30s and 40s. First, because of prohibition, and my grandfather was an agent then too. But when prohibition was repealed, the price for moonshine actually kept going up. In 1946, and I know this for a fact, I've researched it, a gallon of moonshine was $20. That was a fortune in 1946. So when that happened, organized crime was drawn into it because of the money. But the real reason that my grandfather was such a crusader against it was he saw the impacts of alcoholism and of bad moonshine on his community, especially on kids. If your dad was an alcoholic in 1940s and you were already dirt poor, you had nowhere to go, nowhere to turn. And he saw a lot of men blinded by methanol because the moonshiners didn't know what they were doing. He saw a lot of men poisoned by lead because some moonshiners used car radiators instead of a proper still. In one case, he had 38 people killed in one night by methanol in Atlanta in an area called Buttermilk Bottoms. So he was an unapologetic crusader against moonshine stills, and these stills were deep in the woods. The moonshiners would shoot the revenuers without even hesitating, and you had to be an excellent tracker, an excellent outdoorsman, and pretty handy with a gun to even do that job. He also solved the biggest murder case in Georgia history, biggest by the number of law enforcement officials that got involved. Murder of a man named Wilson Turner by a killer named John Wallace. That murder was made into a movie in 1983, starring Johnny Cash playing a sheriff and Andy Griffith playing the killer. The only time Andy Griffith ever played a bad guy. But they left all my grandfather's investigative work out of it, and that is a fascinating part of the story that I bring to light in my book, Moonshine Over Georgia.
As a person that loves history and learning about what was going on I feel like the old days, but the good days, because it doesn't seem like there's many good days coming about, especially with the politicians in power right now. I like to read books like yours. I want to talk about this because do you feel like this is similar to, was what's going on now with fentanyl or marijuana?
There's a very strong parallel to that. Moonshine wasn't as readily toxic as, say, fentanyl. Right. So in other words, you might have to drink 3 or 4 glasses of, even if it was the methanol version, to get really deathly sick, where you may have some warning there. With fentanyl, it's just a few grains may kill you. But still, for its time, it was a very deadly thing. And then, of course, as I mentioned, organized crime got involved, especially in the 40s, because there was so much money to be made. And you saw a little bit of that shown on the miniseries Boardwalk Empire and shows of that nature. And in the South, especially the Bible Belt, when the city fathers just thought, hey, some guys getting drunk on weekends, that's one thing. But when organized crime started building prostitution houses and gambling houses in the Bible Belt, they wanted a stop put to it. And my grandfather, I actually got to interview one moonshiner that my grandfather arrested in 1946. I found him in a nursing home in Panama City Beach, Florida. He was 93 when I interviewed him. Very clear-minded, very clear memory. And he told me, he said, your grandfather was fearless, he was relentless, and he pretty well single-handedly shut down the liquor business in the western part of Georgia.
That's some pretty deep research to find somebody in a
Yeah.
nursing home at 93. So God bless you for that.
Yeah, he was a great interview. It was one of the most fascinating 3 hours of my life.
Wow. Again, for people listening, whether it's the radio or on the podcasting sites, Chris Gates, the book is Moonshine Over Georgia. Definitely check it out on Amazon, or wherever you can get your books sold. You can go to any pretty much store and just ask them. They'll order it in general. I want to talk a little bit about this. So, you wrote this book, and from listening to previously interviews about you with the book, it seems like you started out writing this book at a young age. So was this just your grandfather telling you stories as, you were growing up, or your dad, or who was it that got you interested at such a young age to write this book and finish it at this time?
Yeah, that's very good research on your part. And I was inspired when I was young because I was in my grandfather's hip pocket every chance I got. We went hunting. He taught me fishing. We were very passionate about the same things. I gardened with him. I farmed with him. And so we'd be out in the woods, and he'd get a twinkle in his eye, and he'd say, you see that creek right there? And he'd tell me about how he found a still there in 1938, or how we were going somewhere one time and there was an old, just looked like a harmless country store. But that store had been owned by the mob in the 40s, and he busted a huge illegal poker operation in that store and told me a fascinating story about it. But what really inspired me was, ironically, we were watching the Andy Griffith Show. This was years before Andy made the movie about the killer, and a character came on named Rafe Hollister, who was the Mayberry area moonshine. They were doing comedy around the Rafe Hollister character, and my grandfather began to cry, and he snapped the TV off really abruptly. And I said, Pop, what's the matter? And he said, it wasn't like that, son. There was nothing funny about the moonshine business. And he started talking about the children that he saw fall through the social safety net and basically be sacrificed when their dads were blinded or killed by bad moonshine, or just became alcoholics. And he really began to sob. I was 12 years old that day. And even though I wasn't a writer yet, I said, one of these days I'm going to tell that story.
And you finally did, which is great. And I hope people read this book. I think it's very important. As we wind down speaking about the book, we have dabbled into it, but we obviously don't want to give the whole book away. We want people to read it. But what do you hope people learn from the book when they do read it?
This is a murder mystery. It's really intriguing from that standpoint. It's about moonshiners and chasing guys through the woods. Very compelling storyline. Even I fictionalized parts of it because I didn't know the whole story, but if the reader will never be able to tell what's fact and what's fiction because I did my job well. But in the end, it's really a story about calling. My grandfather realized that he had a skill set that could help those kids in his community. He was an outstanding outdoorsman. He was a hell of a shot. And he was, as that moonshiner said, he was fearless and relentless. And he never did this job for the money. At the peak of his career, his yearly salary was $2,500. Yet he risked his life every night. And that's when he did his job at night, because moonshiners were always out at night, thus the name Moonshiners. He did that because he thought he could help kids in his community. That was his calling. And we're in 2023. That's really what the story's for. What is our calling in 2023? I was a guy working in a power plant. And I became a policy advisor to 2 administrations because I cared. I educated myself. Nobody handed it to me. I worked my tail off. And then when I was in government, I worked 70-hour weeks. My health was somewhat impacted. I ended up with fighting cancer during that time. But I did it because I wanted to serve my country, and I saw that my country was slipping into a very bad place. And so I hope when readers read this, they'll be inspired to decide what are they called to do.
Unfortunately, it's still in a bad place, but maybe we'll make some changes, God willing, in the next year or two. We'll see how that plays out. I do want to get into the politics aspect of this interview. you were a chemist for 30 years. How does a chemist get involved in politics? Or was politics always a passion of yours growing up in general, Chris?
It was both. I was I was a little bit of an odd kid. At 12, I was just completely enthralled with the Watergate hearings, which were going on live at that time. A lot of boys were out playing ball. I was watching G. Gordon Liddy testify. So that's when I really got the bug. And I was actually siding with the Watergate break-in because I felt like they broke in to stop the Pentagon Papers from being released, which got a lot of guys killed in Vietnam. They went about it in a very ham-handed way. But so I had an early passion for politics. But as a chemist, I worked in power plants, the power generation plants. And I got more and more pulled into a chemist at a power plant should be concerned with the health of the turbine, the health of the boiler, like a patient. But I got more and more pulled into EPA compliance because our power plants were suffering what I described at the time as the death by 1,000 green cuts. One regulation after another, after another, after another was going to put us out of business, and now has put the two plants that I worked in out of business. One of them has actually been torn down because of environmental regulations. So I saw that our electrical grid was being put in jeopardy by stupid environmental policy. And I began to brainstorm and educate myself what could be driving us to make so many excessive environmental regulations. And that led me to writing some policy papers, publishing some white papers on the topic. And ultimately, I got appointed by Governor Matt Bevin in Kentucky as an energy advisor and was able to try to drive policy somewhat. And we were making great headway in the Bevin administration. Sadly, we did not get reelected in 2019. Then I was appointed to the Trump administration. I was senior advisor to the Deputy Secretary of Energy. And President Trump was the greatest energy president in my lifetime. And I say that with some depth of knowledge. We were making incredible progress there. During my time there, and I was a very, very small part of it, we became not just energy independent, but energy dominant under President Trump, January 2020. And the heartbreaking part is after we were not reelected, we had to watch as a lot of those policies were reversed. And it's been really heartbreaking to watch because we work really hard.
Yeah, well, I used to be, and for people listening to this show and the call-in people know this, I used to be very far to the left, a Bernie Sanders person. I had the shot in 2021 and I got injured, and it really opened up to my eyes really to what I was really listening to my whole life as a 30-year-old man, that all these
Wow.
people that I used to follow, they were lying to me. It was all gaslighting in general. And it's come to my attention that people that, again, I voted for, I thought were Jesus Christ superstar, they were just fooling me and brainwashing me. And, sometimes for some people, it really takes a crisis. It takes something to happen to them to finally have them wake up their eyes and see the light. And that's what happened to me in 2021, that whether it was the COVID nonsense, whether it's this crap going on in the schools, it's really disgusting. The list goes on and on for that matter. But,
Right.
My Governor DeSantis, who I used to hate and not agree with, I think he's doing a pretty damn good job. And I'm very grateful that he's our governor because he did an amazing job during COVID. I hate to dabble into that, but I do want to talk about what's going on in Kentucky tomorrow. Obviously, the big race. You brought up Anthony Bershia winning that election against Matt Bevin in 2019, up for re-election. Bershia, from what I know about him, and I don't know much, you're a Kentuckian, you know more about him than I do, and you obviously ran against him with Matt Bevin as being part of the administration. It seems like he's a guy, and again, you know more about this than me. He's not a far leftist liberal that's one of these psychos. He can kind of get those voters that maybe are on the moderate side. All I know about David Cameron is he's related to Mitch McConnell, and obviously he was the attorney general. He was pivoted in that case with the woman that had her house broken into, and there was some issues with how African-American people felt about him with that. just clean it up a little bit for the viewers and the listeners about what's going on tomorrow, because that's just bits and pieces by me.
Yeah, I actually know both men quite well. When I was in the governor's office, my office door was about 50 feet from Andy Bashir's office door when he was Attorney General. And then I know Daniel personally as a friend, and have helped him some as a volunteer when he was running for Attorney General, and have just had a chance to be around him a lot. Outstanding guy, really a deep thinker. I would even call him a generational candidate. But I'm glad you described Andy that way, because that's the way most people would perceive him outside of Kentucky, and a lot of people in Kentucky, because Andy is an outstanding actor. He is as liberal as the days are long on policy, but he's good at not being too out there and showing it. He can't get too much liberal stuff done because we own the legislature. We have a supermajority in the House and Senate. And by the way, that's largely thanks to Matt Bevin and the intense campaigning he did while he was governor. But they have kept him in check. But he did close schools and churches during COVID. He does have a transgender agenda for the school system. He's a wholly owned subsidiary of the teachers union. He's against school choice. He's pro-abortion from the word go. So I really hope that Kentuckians see that and see through some of the facade, because he does come across as a nice guy. He's good. He's very charming, but his policies are not nice, and he's pretty well tied in with the Biden administration and with the National Democratic Party. So he's not going to stray too far from their policy positions. So I really hope Kentuckians see the light. And I will say this, the polls that you're reading about, especially it's an Emerson College poll that have Daniel down 16, are absurd. That poll has been very wrong before. It's probably closer, according to, and I just talked to the Republican Party of Kentucky the other night, we're about a 3-point race, maybe even now a 2-point race, with 8% undecided. And undecideds broke hard for President Trump in Kentucky in 2020. So let's just say he gets 4.5% of the undecided votes. Daniel's going to be the governor tomorrow.
I was told that it was a 1-point race on Fox. They had a special on Fox
Oh,
News
good.
Sunday. That's the only poll that I saw. But I did see a while back on Real Clear Politics.
Well, even my 2 points was last Thursday. So Fox may have finally come to their senses and quoted the right poll. You know how polls tighten right before an election anyway.
Right. Well, I always thought that, because I remember when this first was coming about with this race and how it was shaping up, that it always looked like Bashir was ahead. Obviously, it's tough to beat an incumbent president, an incumbent governor, attorney general. The list goes on and on. But I do agree with you. It's going to be close. And anybody that thinks it's 16 points in any direction is psycho. We saw that when they said that Biden was up by like 16 points in Florida back in 2020, and Trump won it by 3 points. And we knew that wasn't going to happen. People on the ground in the state of Florida, whether you were a Democrat or Republican during that time, it was a total joke. I want to continue on because I do want to be gracious with your time, Chris, and just talk about the Bevin administration. Again, going by a person that doesn't live in Kentucky. We didn't hear the good things about Matt Bevin. We heard a lot of the bad things through the mainstream liberal media, that he was against the IRS, which, I don't think the IRS is legal in general. That's another story for another day. But besides that, that he was just some kind of maniac that was cutting, and he wasn't spending at all. As working in the administration, knowing the governor personally at that time, give the audience a little bit of what you feel Governor Bevin was to the state of Kentucky, and also what you think was his biggest accomplishment in office as governor.
You mentioned earlier in the interview, I was a chemist for 30 years, so I worked with chemists and engineers. I've published chemistry technical papers across the country. I worked with smart guys my whole life. That being said, Matt Bevin's the smartest guy I ever worked for. He was highly intelligent, highly accomplished, a military officer, airborne Army, self-made man, grew up poor, became quite wealthy because of his own hard work and sweat equity. And one area that he was particularly talented in was investment for retirement funds. So when he ran for governor, it was primarily because he saw the public pension system in Kentucky was in a crisis, and it still is. Around I think it's $40 billion in debt. So it's on the verge of failure. So he felt like he could fix that. And that's what he ran on. And he attacked that problem head on in his first year or two of the administration. And unfortunately, the teachers union turned on him. It's a real long and sordid tale, but some of the teachers union officials were probably not investing the teachers' retirement money very wisely. And they knew that if Matt Bevin started rooting around and making the problem public, they were going to get some of the blame. So they came up with this mantra: Matt Bevin's going to steal your pension. Matt Bevin's radical. Well, just the opposite was true. He was trying to save the teacher's pension. And when he was able to sit down and go to meetings, which he did across the state with teachers, he could explain it to them and convince them. But you can't meet with every teacher in Kentucky, and we couldn't get out in front of the media lies and the propaganda machine of the teachers union. So that really killed us. But he did have a number of accomplishments. One of them was he passed right to work legislation for the first time in Kentucky history. Kentucky's always been so union dominated, it was hard for us to get big business here. He got it to be a right to work state so that you can be in a union, but you cannot be forced to be in a union. And then we got some outstanding and very important pro-life legislation passed in Kentucky. We had almost every abortion clinic in Kentucky closed. Some of them sadly have reopened under Bashir, but we had closed all but one. And so he had made some huge inroads there. He also improved the foster care system. Governor Bevin and his wife had adopted 4 children of their own. So they were very passionate about the adoption and foster care system, and he made some real great progress there. We had a lot more for our second term, and we would have fixed that pension system. But we were one of those state capitals, and you probably saw it on the news, where teachers were lied to by their union leadership. So they and Teamsters, who weren't even in the teachers union, showed up at the state capitol by the thousands and just threw a fit, basically, protested and scared the legislature out of really tackling the problem. So that ended up being a lot of bad PR, and that's the primary thing that shortened our administration. But Matt Bevin, who I still talk to regularly, just actually spoke to him this past weekend, is a highly honorable, highly intelligent, accomplished man, and Kentucky was suffered a loss when they let him get away.
Last few questions as far as audience questions. And I just want you to correct the record on this before we get into the audience question. My last question before we get into the audience question is, you had a death sentence shortly after joining the Trump administration in 2019. Can you go a little bit deeper into that?
Yeah, I was, let me think, 7 weeks into my work with President Trump as an advisor, and actually had a great opportunity to write a speech for Vice President Pence on energy and help the president's speechwriting team with an energy speech for President Trump. And he was so pleased with the speech that I was invited to breakfast at the White House. Wow. About the second week of February. I started feeling short of breath for a few days. And then one day on my way home from work, I had an apartment there in DC. I didn't even have any furniture. I had an air mattress and a lawn chair. I hadn't moved up officially yet. I passed out. And it turned out I was sent to a hospital, and they found out I had acute lymphoblastic leukemia, blood cancer.
Wow.
And it was not just any leukemia. It was the most deadly form in the world. 98% of the people that get my form of leukemia die. So I was in Washington, and the one doctor who's ever cured my type of leukemia worked out of Sibley Memorial Hospital in Georgetown and out of Johns Hopkins. He was primarily based in Johns Hopkins. And if I'd been in any other city, I would not have made it. But I had massive amounts of chemo, followed by radiation for a month or so, and then a bone marrow transplant. And I have beaten it. I'm 3 years in remission now.
God bless you. And thankfully you were in that spot. I always say that God does things for a reason. So God
Yeah,
was definitely with you through that and made sure you were in the right city for that to happen so you could get
yeah.
cured. Chris, let's move through this quick with these audience questions. Democratic nominee and Republican nominee for 2024. Who do you got?
Oh wow. Uh, well, I'm gonna use a metaphor instead. I
Okay.
think Trump's going to be the Republican nominee. But here's
Okay.
how much confidence I have in the election system as it stands. I think the Democrats could nominate a jack o' lantern, and the Republicans could nominate George Washington reincarnated, and the jack o' lantern would become president.
That's true.
Because I'm really afraid that we haven't cleaned up these voter rolls like we should have. We really never punished the people that stuffed the ballot boxes. We don't have a shutdown on mail in ballots. So until we clean that up, and who's going to do it? I mean, is Biden's Justice Department going to do it? I'm very concerned. Now, here's my hope. Trump is so popular right now. If he can get away from these bogus investigations and actually get the nomination, if he can win by a big enough majority, what do we have, like 37% turnout in the last presidential election? If we could get 45-50% turnout, because I think people have finally awakened, maybe he can overcome the steal. Maybe he can overcome the cheat.
Last question. The government is always changing. You've been in government for quite a while now, worked under different administrations, wrote all sorts of papers on energy. Can you talk about how the government's changed since you got into it and how you think it's going to even evolve more as we end the interview?
Excuse me. I'll tell you, let me get a sip of water here.
Yeah, take your time.
I'll tell you why it didn't change enough. The bureaucracies of
Yeah.
EPA, DOE, even where I worked, the FBI, Justice, these departments are too massive. They have been since Eisenhower. Eisenhower warned us about this. So the only way to really straighten this out is just having the tip of the iceberg, the presidency, is not enough. Unless you're there for 16 years, you can't fix enough stuff. The bureaucracy slows you down, it throws sand in the gears of your policies. So, what you have to do is redefine these organizations. I saw a plan for EPA. It sounds radical, but it's really not. This gentleman thought you should move EPA headquarters to Iowa, to the most remote town in Iowa you can find. Why? Because 90% of the bureaucrats will resign the next day. They're not going to go live in Iowa. They want to be in DC where the cocktail parties are. So you downsize these bureaucracies by moving them out of DC, get them outside the beltway and the bureaucratic money machine, the lobbying money machine, and get them back to their original mission. I got the opportunity to have lunch with the man that founded the EPA under Richard Nixon, and he told me he is embarrassed at what the EPA has become, just a bludgeon for against business, and really something to just push a green agenda that's absurd. So we've got to downsize the bureaucracy so that the president can actually control the people that are supposed to be working for him.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. Now, people can follow you where? Do you have any kind of social media? I know that we tease the book that they can get the book on Amazon or wherever books are sold. Excuse me, I'm fumbling and stumbling over words. But where can people follow you specifically, Chris, if they do?
On Twitter at cskates81, cskates81 on Twitter, or just plain old Chris Skates on Facebook. Be happy to get a friend request from your listeners. Also, on my book, some of your listeners prefer audiobooks. They listen to them on their commute. I have a great audiobook. I was the producer and director. I hired an outstanding voice actor to play my grandfather. So you can find that on Audible or Spotify in a wonderful audiobook form. I wrote the book. I pretty much have it memorized, and I've listened to it 4 times. That's how much fun it is.
Is it more of a short book or is that a longer book? What do you think?
No, it's a 8-hour listen. If you
Okay,
listen to it,
that's
it's
not too
300
bad.
pages.
Yeah, it's not too bad. All right. Well, anyways, Chris, I appreciate you coming on. I do hope people that listen to this buy Moonshine Over Georgia. Again, Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, wherever you get your bookstore, your local bookstore. And then, like as you stated, Chris, if people want to listen to the audio version, they can go get it on Audible or Spotify. I do a lot of Audible and Spotify podcast stuff too. So I do understand that when I'm driving and stuff. But Chris, thanks so much. Look forward to our next conversation down the road.
Yes, thanks for having me on.